Hello everybody and welcome back. So I basically want to introduce you to the first context that we're going to be talking about when using Python in Houdini. And this one is often overlooked and underappreciated, but can honestly be one of the most powerful and time-saving contexts that you would ever use Python. And that is, it's a type of context I like to call Python on the go. So really, it's basically just our ability to use the Python shell and the Python source editor to manipulate things in our scene on the fly. Now, this comes up all the time. Honestly, as a TD, almost every week somebody's calling me over to their desk and saying, hey, do you think, is it possible to do this or that? Or every time I click this node, I'm having to do this, then that, then that. Is there a way to just kind of do that across all 100 nodes that are in my scene, or something like that? Everyone's always trying to find a quicker and easier way to do things, and that's where Python shines. So I want to the first one we're going to cover is just exactly that, using the tools that we've already learned so far, the shell and the source editor, but digging a little bit deeper into how we can actually apply this in our scenes to save ourselves time. Now, I have mentioned this before, but I encourage you to think of Python as almost like a virtual assistant, right? The thing with something like Vex is, if we dive inside here and I'll show you a wrangle. So now Vex is incredibly powerful, of course, but it operates within the confines of this little snippet, right? And its result comes out here, right? We cannot have it click this button up here. We can't have it close this geometry spreadsheet, right? It has no ability to operate outside of itself here. Even with other nodes, you can have nodes plugged in, right? And sure, it can reference those nodes. And you can even reference nodes that are not actually plugged in, but just, you can point to different paths. But all of it is read-only, essentially. And then the only thing that it is able to actually manipulate is the geometry that comes in the first input, but it gets changed inside here and then comes out of the output. That is the limitations of Vex, okay? Whereas with Python, it can do absolutely anything. It can literally come and, change what context we are on this panel or close the panel. It can open up a Windows Explorer for us and create a new folder on our desktop or something. Literally everything you can do, it can do. Even selecting nodes or, literally anything. And because it has this power, you can use it to cut time in half or even less. Like, you can save yourself a ton of time just by noticing when you're doing anything repetitive and recursive and instead just offloading that to Python. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to need to be able to do this, right? Now, in the next few lessons, I'm going to be covering a few of the classes in a little bit more depth, the things that we're going to need to know very well to be able to manipulate our scenes incredibly well. But I just want to start off with a few basics so that we kind of know where to start, because in Python there is a lot of information. If we look at that, the who module, right? This has so much in it, okay? And each of these are either a function or a class or a module of them their own. There is so much information. So I don't expect you guys to just go and memorize all of this. Instead, I want to point you in the right direction to a few where we can start. A few common things that we're actually going to use on a daily basis. And once you know how to use those, it's very easy to add on additional functions or classes or whatever. Right. So one of the first ones that we're going to use quite a lot within your scene, especially for just sort of Python on the go type stuff, is the who.playbar, right? So this is a sub module of of the who module. So you see I mentioned before that there are some modules in here. So they won't have the round brackets, so they're not a function, but they're also not a class of their own either. They're actually a module, which then has its own functions, classes, and potentially even other submodules. Okay. So it's a lot of fun to go through these, so you guys can in your own time kind of just go through here and see if there's a few things that you can do. You know, I love just jumping in and saying, oh, hang on, over here, look, I can click play. I mean, I didn't even know you could do that. Like, go here, who dot play bar. Now remember, when you reference a module, you just put a dot. There is no function call, so that's why we go who dot, because we're calling the Houdini module. Inside of that module, we're calling the play bar module, and then inside of that module, we're calling this function. So we say play. This is a function, so it has the round brackets, and then it asks for no arguments. So, all right, let's see if that works. Hey, that's cool. See, so our play bar goes and plays, and then presumably we can go stop. No. That one didn't work. Interesting. Well, anyway, so I encourage you guys to, you know, very ironically, play around within these modules. So just, you know, have fun, see what you can do. But primarily we're going to use things like asking the play bar for the frame range, because sometimes we need the first frame or the last frame. Okay. Or we want to, sometimes we'll use like event callbacks and things based on the timeline. I guess that's mostly it. Is just using time range and frame range and that type of stuff. We can also check the increment. That is often very important. So this is one that is good to know, especially because it is contained within its own module. There are a few that are outside of it. So here, things like who.frame is not inside the play bar module. So it's kind of important to know that there's this play bar group of things, but some of the functions are outside, and then some things are contained within the module of play bar. And this is mostly why I wanted to point this out, because it took me a long time assuming that, you know, I knew that who.frame was a function. So then you start looking for the function for frame range and you can't find it. That's because it's actually inside of another module. Right. So play bar is a good one. Then also something we're going to use quite a lot is who.ui. Okay. Now what the who.ui, it's another module, right? Another submodule. And what this does is it relates to all sorts of things that kind of interact with the user, right? Now, sometimes you won't want to use this with just sort of on-the-go stuff. If you want to manipulate a whole bunch of things in your scene, you would just go and maybe type something in the shell, click enter, you're inputting the information. So you often don't need the UI. But occasionally you do want it to maybe pop up with some kind of input, especially if what you're doing in the viewport, well, in your scene, is something useful that you want to package into a tool. Well, later on, you don't want to have to type that code again and input those values again in the actual shell. So then you can build a tool where you can just run it off the shelf, and through a UI, it will ask you for that information. So for example, if we go a little bit down here, you'll see there's a display message. So sometimes you want to error, throw up an error, and you can't guarantee that your user has their Python shell open. Like I told you before, always have one open, but especially people that are a little less technical will not know that and will certainly not think to have a Python shell open. So if you're going to error, especially with any tools that we build, we're going to need to know this. So we go who.ui.display message, and it asks for only one argument that it has to have, and the rest are default. But you'll see there's a lot of arguments here, so there's a lot of ways of essentially customizing this function, and it'll explain to you what each one of them does, right? But we're just gonna say, hey there, right? And you see it pops up an actual message with a button, so we go okay, and you'll see it even returns which button we pressed. Okay, so in here, if we've gone and actually given it more buttons, which you'll see by default there's only one, and it's a tuple of strings that it uses as the labels for each button. So because there was only one by default, it had only one, but maybe we say okay, no, and cancel, right? So when I run this, it now gives me all these options, and if I click the middle one, no, then that's returning 1. It's saying to me, of these, that's 0, that's 1, that's 2. So now you know what your user has actually clicked, and we can base a bunch of scripts on that. Okay. There's also read input. This one's actually useful as well. who.ui.read input, right? And we do have to give it some kind of text. Oh, damn it. Input something. Sometimes when this little window pops up, by the way, guys, just be careful. If your cursor is just below here, and as you start typing, this thing pops up. While your cursor is over here, nothing seems to type. So just in case that ever happens to you, just be careful. You know, maybe don't look up and make sure that it's typing before you go and type the whole thing. So when we put in here read input, it basically lets us give a message so that we can explain what the user is actually being asked to answer, and then they can input something. So you might ask them to name their scene or name the node or whatever. So then you go, I'd like to call it my node, and it goes okay, and then that information comes to us. So see at the end of this read input, that little triangle, well, the little arrow, that's basically saying this returns something with an integer, a tuple with an integer and a string. And it'll actually explain what it returns, or it normally does. Sometimes, guys, it does actually not really explain. Okay, here it is, explaining it in the description. But there are a few that don't. It's actually quite bad that most of them do, but I have come across one or two functions where what it returns, you're very confused, and you have to actually, through trial and error, figure out what the things are that it's returning. Because it might return 3 integers, but you're like, well, what is that? What is that? Is the first one which button they pressed, and the second one is something else, you know? So anyway, but it does explain it here in the description. So it returns a tuple containing an integer and then text. So the string is the text that we entered, and the integer is the index of the button, of the press button, right? So that's the same as with our display message. So we know which button they pressed, and we know what they input. Okay, and then we can obviously use this in our script. So now that they've named this, we could go and take that tuple and take the second index of that and now use that as our node name. Okay, so this is quite useful. We'll use this quite a bit. And then super useful, like probably one of the most useful, is the who.node class and also the who.parm class. Okay, but I'm not going to go into these in detail now, because literally the next 2 lessons are going to be on these 2 classes, because these are so powerful across all contexts. We need to understand this through and through in order to do everything else that we're going to do for the rest of this course. So I'm going to go through these, explain what some of them do, even show you in practice how they work. This is going to be vital to understand, right? So the who.node class we will be going over, and who.parm. Now, parm is just the short form of saying parameter, right? It's just the sort of scripting kind of way of shortening this. So, and you hear me talk about parms. It's actually become a habit now. I type the word parm so often that I've almost forgotten that it refers to parameter. I just call them parms now. And then you're often talking to someone, just select that parm, and they're like, what is a parm? So you can tell all of the coders by the fact that they use the word parm. Anyway, and then, so like I said, there will be a whole lesson dedicated to parms. So yeah, we will go into that in much more detail, because manipulating parameters and nodes in your scene is essentially the primary thing that we're going to be doing in Python. And then there are a few functions that we are going to just come across that are quite useful in this Houdini module, right? So who.node, for example, not the class but the function, is very, very important to know how to grab an instance of the class. Remember when we created our classes and then we were able to create an instance of that class? So we said we've got a human class, and now we're going to create a human, like an actual human called Jimmy, right? Well, with the who.node class, you actually cannot just instantiate an instance of that class. You can't just call who.node and create an instance of it. Instead, you have to run a function which creates an instance of that node, and that's what this function is. Because it has to grab additional information from an actual node in your scene. It has to have a path and refer to a node that exists in your scene. You can't create a theoretical link to a node that doesn't exist. Okay, so that's why it's very important to know that this function is how we create an instance, a Python instance of a node that actually already exists in our scene. Okay. And then very similar to that is our who.parm function. Okay, same thing. It's going to be a reference to an actual node. And you'll see here, there's a little shortcut, which I have shown you guys before. If you drag a node into the Python shell, it will appear in here as an actual call of the who.node function. And the same thing happens here with your parameters, your parms. You can drag them in. And this actually teaches you something, because it teaches you how to fill in the code. But also look here, when I drag translate, you'll see that it doesn't actually run the who.parm, it runs who.parm tuple, because it's grabbing the entire tuple, the x, y, and z value as one parameter, right, instead of each one. And unfortunately, there's no way for us to actually drag the individual parameters. So if we just want to refer to tx, we actually have to type it, or we can do this, but then you have to take away the tuple part, because you want to refer to just a single parameter, and then we have to give it x, because the parameters are called tx, ty, and tz, but the parm tuple is called t. So we have to do it this way when we refer to the actual individual parameter, and then parm tuple when we refer to the entire tuple. Okay, so just look out for that. Okay, then, okay, we saw it earlier, but the who.frame function, it was in the playbar section, but remember, it's not actually under the playbar module, right? And the who.frame is going to be very useful for us, because sometimes we need to actually ask what the frame is. Essentially, it's our Python equivalent of saying $f. Okay, we're asking what frame is it, so we go $f. But if we want $rf start or $rf end or f start or whatever, then we use the playbar module to grab the frame range, and that'll return a tuple of start and end, and then we just grab whichever index we want. Okay, so it's good to know these equivalents in Python, because we can't just type $f, it does nothing. Okay, and then $fps as well. So sometimes you want to know the frame rate, specifically because you often want to multiply or divide by the frame rate. So we can just do who.fps, and it'll tell us our current frames per second. All right, then there's another one which we can do, which is very, very useful for creating references to nodes, is who.selectedNodes. Right, so this function, let's actually bring it up in here. So who.selectedNodes, what this does is it returns a list of selected nodes. So the list is going to be a list of node references, but what's cool is that it's actually based on your selection, and not just, so I've got nothing selected and I run this, it's going to return an empty tuple. Exactly the same function, but with a node selected, and it will return a tuple which has one entry, which is a reference to that node. And I could have multiple nodes in my scene, and now it returns a list of 3 nodes. So that's really cool way of interacting with the scene and saying, okay, well, I want to go and grab a selection and apply my script that I've quickly made, but only to the nodes that I've got selected. Okay, so that's a cool one. And then, like I said, we don't have access to just our normal like $F or dollar whatever, and sometimes you want these variables. You want access to our global or environment variables. So the equivalent in Python of calling your dollar variables is getEnv, right? So this is going to get your environment variables, which will be any of them that are listed in here. So I've shown you this before. So this whole list over here of variables, and it's good to sometimes go through this and see what variables actually get created. You can actually, for example, check your username because that's already in here. So you don't have to go and like create it or whatever. You can check some information to do with the actual machine itself, like what operating system they're using, and then obviously some of the Houdini variables like our hip file, right? So we can say who.getEnv, and then we just feed it a string of hip, as opposed to saying $hip, we just give it a string, but it must be in capitals as well, as far as I know. And then it will return our hip file, right, with location, which I haven't saved, so it's just a default location. And then you can also set environment variables, which is pretty cool. So here you can say who.putEnv. Now I thought I should really show you this because it's a bizarre name for it. You would normally think that get, so the opposite would be set. And there's even who.unsetEnv, right? But why it's put and not set, I have absolutely no idea. So your guess is as good as mine, but just remember that for this specific one with the environment variables, for some reason it's putEnv. And then you choose a name for your environment variable, and then you give it a value. So you can overwrite ones that already exist, or you can create a new one. So my var, and then you give it a value. So I don't know, let's just say 3, right? Oh, okay. That's strange. Okay, I guess it only wants strings then in here. So I mean, it should specify that in here, but anyway. So let's give it a string and see what. Well, I'm still going to give it the number 3. There we go. So that it takes that, right? So we can say who.getEnv my var, and it will now return 3. So if we wanted to store actual numbers, you could go and store them as strings and then just convert. That is a bit strange that it wants specifically that. Now if we come back to our list here, you'll see that it should appear in this list. So what do we call it? My var. So it should be under M. Oh, it'll add it at the bottom. Okay, there we go. So it's added there. Oh, and it'll be at the bottom, I guess, because we used lowercase, not capitals, right? Houdini has a tendency to always sort things capital letters first and then lowers, which is always good to know. So there our variable exists. Okay. So this is a good list to know because we can actually set variables for the scene. Now remember, this is only in my actual current session. If I close this whole session and open a new one, my var will not exist. Okay. All right, so that's environment variables. And then another one, just a little bit of an outlier, but it is useful sometimes, is the H script. Because there are some commands that have not been converted over to Python. There is no Python equivalent. And so if we want to use something that already exists in H script, we can do so just by calling H script and then just feeding it an actual string that is the command. So obviously if you don't know H script or whatever, don't worry. I mean, you'll be able to do literally 99.9% of things directly in Python. But there is the occasional things that you just need, or it's just easier doing in H script, because there might be an H script command that does something in one line, where in Python you have to maybe type a little bit. So you just go who.h script, and then it must be a string. Okay, so you feed it a string with the whole line that you would type. So something like, I don't know, let's do the up parm, and we point to our obj go1, and we'll maybe take its scale node, scale parm. So this is scale, and we'll just set that to be equal to 10. Right, so when we click on go1, we'll see that we've now set scale to 10. Okay, so I mean, obviously we could do that exact same thing in Python easily, but there are one or two things that I've found that are, especially in terms of like moving panels around, or like creating and opening new windows and things like that, or sort of certain settings in your actual like display settings that Python has issues with manipulating, where HScript has functions for that. So you can just use that if you absolutely need to. Right. In fact, I actually believe that there's a Vex equivalent as well, that you can run Vex script, although obviously Vex will not be useful outside of the actual geometry. So you would probably run that in a Python node, because just like there are Wrangle nodes, there is also an actual Python SOP that you would then run maybe some Vex code in the middle of your Python, which can be very useful because Python has a lot more powerful things like the way that it can actually loop and do and check external data. So it's a lot less limited than Vex, but sometimes you want to run a Vex code with that kind of high level awareness. So you can do it inside of a Python SOP and then just call a Vex function. Let's just check if it is here. Yeah, there we go. So Vex, so run Vex, you'd be able to run some actual Vex code. Okay. But yeah, I very rarely have ever needed to use anything like this. Once or twice I've used this HScript thing, but that's about it. But it's just good to know that it exists in case you do know those other languages and you're wanting to integrate these all together. Okay, so these are a few of the tricks and things that we're going to need to know, and just the right sort of thinking, the fact that we know that Python can manipulate everything inside of our scene, just like we can. Anything we can click on and move and close and do whatever, it can do too, which means that when you're sitting with your scene going, you've got like 100 nodes in the scene, and suddenly you've realized that all of them are named just slightly wrong, and your scripts or whatever, maybe your submitter is based on the name. You've got a bundle set up or something for render, and it's expecting it to all have the name like char underscore at the front of it, right? Well, now we can go and select all these nodes and write a very quick little Python script to say, hey, go through all my nodes, check the type, and if it's a geometry type, then change it, like add the word char to the beginning of the name. Okay, so it's that type of stuff that we need to do beyond just creating actual shelf tools and HDAs and things like that. Is the first step is using Python directly in your actual scene to do things that you would have to now go and rename. If you find yourself getting bored, then you're doing it wrong. Because if you start doing this and going, oh man, I'm going to have to do this to all of these nodes, well then the answer is always Python, because it can do anything that you're doing. So if you need to do it 100 times, it's quicker to just type 3 lines of code and say, hey, do it to everything I've got selected. Okay, so in the next lesson we're going to dive deep into the who.node class and start picking it apart. I'll show you exactly everything we can do with nodes, how we can manipulate them, create them, destroy them, check types, do everything with nodes. And then after that we're going to discuss parameters, because those are probably the 2 most important classes in Houdini, and we're going to use it throughout this entire course. When you can understand those 2, then you can do almost everything. And then just refer back to this lesson if you want. There's a few other tricks, the UI and the play bar stuff and setting some environment variables. Those are just little admin-y things that you often need to do in amongst manipulating nodes and parameters. Right. So I hope that was useful to you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.